one way that AI is really transforming things is in simple things like bouncing ideas off of a human. So if a human copywriter maybe has a brief, a direction they want to go in, they can build an AI copywriting agent. That agent may return 100 lines of copy in a minute, which a human could never do. And even if 90% of those lines of copy are garbage, those 10 might have some insights that a creative person can ingest and turn into something really impactful. And we've actually seen this happen on campaigns that we've worked on, where a human and an AI bot are working together to drive creative ideation.
L-shaped overlays are seemingly everywhere, something we've been hearing a lot about lately, from Prime's Thursday Night Football to CTV ads in general. Mel wants to know, well, one, what are L-shaped overlays, just to get that out of the way, but also, are they really driving better performance, and if so, how?
Yeah, when it comes to L-shaped overlays, or any overlay for that matter, it's really kind of the question of when to overlay and when to not overlay. And so that's step one in terms of can it drive performance. The first question we should ask is, should we be doing this? If you're, say, Nike, and you have a really emotional, anthemic spot, you don't want to distract from that with an overlay. So that would be an opportunity to say, to express some restraint and not execute an overlay. On the other hand, if you've got a more performance driving campaign, then an overlay can really help drive personalization. So if you're reaching, say, a sneakerhead audience versus a sports bettor audience, maybe you can use that overlay to speak to different elements of your brand, of your proposition, of your reason to believe and go take an action that can speak to those audiences. And that's a way that overlays can drive performance, when you're using them to drive personalization and do so in a hyper-relevant way. One key thing, though, is you never want your overlay to be too cluttered, because you have to keep in mind there's a base video running, there might be supers in that, there might be a VO, and you don't want your overlay to distract from the main point. You want your overlay to complement and provide additional reasons for audiences to actually lean in and be engaged, which ultimately is what's going to drive business outcomes, because the ad no one sees does nothing, right? Pretty simple statement. The next question is, well, how do you get someone to notice something? And what we find is by making it relevant, you attract attention, which ultimately is the first step to driving business outcomes.
Mel, you raised a lot of great points about personalization, but the idea of personalization is kind of comes as a double-edged sword. There's the idea that, when it comes to personalized creative, the idea that something's tailored to the individual is great, but there's also the expensive dynamic ad servers and the massive production budgets. Can brands achieve meaningful personalization more simply?
Yes, brands can definitely achieve meaningful personalization in a more simple way than, say, tapping into a dynamic ad server, having thousands of variations, maybe plugging into complex APIs. And there is a time and a place for that complexity. For instance, a, say, retargeting campaign where there are thousands of products that you might want to feature in a retargeted ad. On the other hand, when brands are leaning into personalization for the first time, we often recommend they start simple and prove it worked. And they can essentially then avoid some of the extra costs that come with dynamic ad serving, heightened production budgets. And so again, a simple way to approach this is to think of what are the priorities? What is going to make someone engage? Oftentimes it comes down to things like behavioral characteristics. So who are we talking to? Contextual elements, like where are we reaching them? And if we set up a plan where we can test driving relevance with creative that's leaning into an audience behavior or a contextual environment against creative that isn't, we can very simply set up a hypothesis and then prove it out. And once we see it works, then maybe think about how do we evolve, how do we drive more complexity, but not just because we can, but because we think we can actually have meaningful creative that will engage audiences.
Mel, the idea of the great unbundling or rebundling has been an issue in terms of creative and media buying planning. Those silos coming down has been something that the industry has hoped for a long time. Are we seeing the structures of P&Ls between these agencies, between these agency units being merged or changing in any specific ways?
And so what we do is, again, being part of a media agency is first and foremost lean into audience data, media data, contextual data, any data we can get our hands on to inform our media plan, and then say, now how can we make that plan come to life with creative that's actually going to drive performance?
So to dive in a bit more on that performance angle in terms of how creative innovation has an impact on the ultimate business outcomes, how can you measure that effectively?
The most effective way to measure if innovation is actually driving bottom line results is to test, test, and test, and particularly A/B test. So if we're trying a new initiative, we're going to want to launch that campaign with what we would have done otherwise, so maybe a generic version of creative, but also run our personalized version of creative at 50/50 impressions for stat sig results. And that way, you can prove that when you ran a personalized piece of creative, it drove better results than a non-personalized piece of creative. So that's just one example of how we can use testing to actually prove that innovation is driving results. Once you've established a baseline of performance, that's again where you want to continue to evolve, continue to test, continue to learn, and lean into what's working and stop what's not.